This Restorative Justice Life is a production of Amplify RJ. Follow us on all social media platforms at Amplify RJ or sign up for our email list to stay up to date on everything we have going on. And to get the most involved, join our free Mighty Networks community to get connected with others living this restorative justice life all over the world. As far as this podcast goes, make sure you're subscribed, leave a rating and review, and share with a friend to help us further amplify this work. Enjoy the episode. Welcome to This Restorative Justice Life, the podcast that explores how the philosophy, practices, and values of restorative justice apply to our everyday lives. I'm your host, David Ryan Barcega Castro Harris, all 5 names for the ancestors, and I'm the founder of Amplify RJ. On this podcast, I talk with RJ practitioners, circle keepers, and others doing this work about how this way of being has impacted their lives. David, welcome to This Restorative Justice Life. Who are you?
I am trying my best to do right.
Who are you?
I am a father and a husband, father of 2 daughters and a husband to Kate.
Who are you?
I am someone who loves to help people resolve conflict.
Who are you?
I am a healer and a community builder.
Who are you?
I am someone who gets healing from nature.
Who are you?
I am funny.
And finally, for now, who are you?
I am a musician.
We're going to talk about so many of those intersections throughout our conversation, but thank you so much for being here. We'll get back to it right after this.
Hey folks, I'm Elise, your producer, and today we are welcoming David Yusem to the podcast. David Yusem is a Restorative Justice Coordinator at the Oakland Unified School District. You'll hear so much from David, and I actually first met him at the NACRJ conference where he discussed the intersection between jazz, restorative justice, and John Coltrane, which you will hear a lot more about, as well as what restorative justice looks like in schools and other settings. Without further ado, let's get into it.
David, it is so good to be with someone who shares my namesake. David, I believe you're the first other David to be here on the pod, so good to be among the beloved. We've had a handful of conversations before this, so it's good to get this recorded. To the fullest extent that you want to answer the question right now, how are you?
I tend to have a pretty sunny disposition a lot of the time. I try to keep it positive, even when things can get me down. Right now, school just started last week, at the beginning of last week. So there's a lot going on. There's a lot of, I'm juggling a lot of things, which can be stressful. But, ultimately, I think I'm blessed to be able to do this work, especially with young people. So feeling pretty good about that.
For people who haven't read the show notes yet or haven't fully looked at the description, you're working at Oakland Unified School District. Some would say, or many point to as one of the examples of folks who have been doing restorative justice work well and for a long time. We're going to get to the story of you and doing that work with OUSD in a minute, but you've been doing work that is restorative for a long time, probably before you knew the words restorative justice. Oh, yeah. So in your own words, how did that get started for you?
I think I've always sort of naturally was inclined to helping people resolve issues, conflict, misunderstandings. I am able to see multiple sides to a thing. And I didn't really realize that not everybody had that skill set or sort of natural way of being in the world. In my late 20s, I was kind of trying to figure out what I wanted to do in this life. And, I was playing music and in a band and touring and recording, and I was really enjoying that. But I was also kind of searching for, what am I going to do in this life? And the funny thing is, I was down at the grocery store down the street, and in the parking lot, there was a sticker on the back of a car, and it said, "Mediators do it until everyone's satisfied." And I was like, mediation, mediation. Maybe I should look into mediation, And right as I was leaving a note on the car to be like, "Hey, do you know of any trainings or anything like this?" This was in 2000. And the woman came out and she's just like, "Yeah, we have a training coming up." And that was with this organization called Conciliation Forums of Oakland at the time. And so in the spring of 2000, I took a mediator training, like a 40-hour mediator certificate community mediation training. And that just lit me up. Like, I was like, yes. I mean, I didn't even know what an I statement was or like anything. I was very green, but all I knew is that it really felt good. And it felt like it was something that, reached into my soul, and it was like, wow, this feels like I could do this. And so I started practicing at volunteering basically. And they put me on all kinds of mediations, anything you can imagine, families, landlord, tenant, neighbors, organizations, schools, like all kinds of things, fender benders, you name it. And so I kind of cut my teeth and I started volunteering for organizations in Contra Costa County and Berkeley, Castro Valley, just anywhere around here that did community mediation. I eventually ended up getting a real entry-level position at what used to be called mediation services in Castro Valley, and real, case development position. And within about 6 months, the program director left and I became the program director there. Same time, I was on the board of the organization that Berkeley and Oakland had merged, and I was on that board. And so anyway, long story short is all three of those organizations merged together into one called Seeds, which is where I became the community mediation program manager and was running that, mediation program, working with volunteers, helping people resolve conflict in the community, served all of Alameda County here in the Bay. And it was in 2007 that I had first heard about restorative justice.
So I'm going to pause you. You talked about early on in life, you realized that not everyone had this analysis of, I want to help people. I can see both sides. Like, where did that develop for you?
I think it's from my ancestors. I think it's just passed down through the ages from my ancestors, and my sense of justice, my sense of doing the right thing, of healing, and providing a space for people to talk and reason together and work things out. And so I feel like it's that deep for me. And it's a skill set I think that can be honed or worked on like a muscle. And I think unconsciously I was been doing that my whole life. I can remember in elementary school, kind of being the person, breaking up fights and being like, look, can we just he's just saying this, you're just saying that. It's really the same thing, that kind of thing. And then I noticed people started relying on me to be that person, almost like thinking it was okay for them to get into a conflict if I was present, because they know that I would be there to be like, let's just talk this out, And so I think I became conscious of it though in my 20s at some point, like I said, and started realizing that while not everybody probably has this ability or the skill or even the desire, And interestingly enough, at around that time, one of my grandparents had this picture up in their house, and it's a picture of my great grandfather with his family in a shtetl. Well, a shtetl is like a Jewish ghetto, and this is in Ukraine. And it was him and his family. So it had pictures of, my great grandfather, he was 8 years old. And then, his family up to my, great grandfather and great grandmother and so forth. But the point is that someone pointed to the old man in the picture, long white beard, classic, old school, look. And they said he was the village mediator. And he was the guy that helped people resolve disputes in this village. And back then, everybody just had a first name, and at one point they were made to take a last name. And so his last name became what he did, just like a lot of people at that time. And so his last name became Dean, and which is the Yiddish word for someone who resolves disputes or helps people work things out. And so that's why I kind of say it's from my ancestors.
I was going to ask for a specific ancestor, but like you just shared that. And of course, I imagine, some of those skills, those ways of being get passed down. But yeah, no, that's beautiful. When you talk about like being that person who people go to and like knowing that like, oh, it's okay that like we can get David will like help us sort this out. That's either embraced or that's something that people back away from. It seems like you really embraced that way. And so when you were doing mediation work, it sounds like you were really energized. Were there any like particular cases that stood out and that felt really good. Like, yeah, I'm really doing what I'm meant to be doing in this.
Wow. I mean, I mediated hundreds of cases probably. You know, I did kinship mediations for the court in Contra Costa County. So young, people who had been removed from their parents because their parents had done something. Typically it was had to do around drug addiction or mental health or something like that. And so the judge would refer to mediation. And so I would sit there with the young person and often their mom, sometimes their parents, and just talk about their relationship and what it would take, to reestablish it. And we didn't really necessarily work out like visitation plans. That was for someone else to do. It was more just the relationship, and those were really, really powerful. And I can't necessarily point to one. I mean, there was one where a mom had read her son's journal, which was very private to him. And that was just, for him, that was like the worst invasion of his privacy. And he couldn't possibly see having a relationship with her, having found this out. And so I was able to, create a space for them to talk about that, and for the mom to, explain sort of a deeper reason for that.
You were doing this work with Seeds, Mediation, all of these community organizations, and for about 7 years before you encountered the word restorative justice as a framework. What happened when those words were introduced to you?
So, mediation is really about problem solving a dispute or an issue, coming to sometimes a compromise, sometimes it's collaboration, but it's usually around a particular thing that happened or something that's been ongoing or a misunderstanding. And it's about problem solving and coming to a resolution, and I really enjoy helping people with that. But when I first heard about restorative justice and dug into the philosophy, for me, it was like, wow, this is so much deeper and goes so much further on the relational part of it, and also repairing harm, and then, building community, all that stuff that we can get into. But when I was at Seeds and I was managing the mediation program, someone asked me to come to a meeting at the Oakland City Attorney's Office with some folks from Oakland Unified School District. And they wanted to talk about some of the processes at the district that could be made, mediation could be used. But someone came by one of those meetings. I think it was Heather Manchester, who is just one of my mentors when it comes to youth engagement and restorative justice. She came by with a flyer for a talk that I think Sujatha Baliga was going to give on like happiness or something. And she meant, and the talk, I think, was sponsored by Restorative Justice for Oakland Youth. And I was like, restorative justice, what's that? And I just started, because I had this platform at Seeds where I could practice it, I just started to like really get into it. I connected with RJ pretty deeply at that time with Fania Davis, and I got some initial training through Rita Alfred. And RJ at that time was bringing out a lot of people from like Eastern Mennonite University and from Minnesota and all over to do training. So I just took as much training as I could possibly get. And because I had this platform at Seeds, I just started practicing it, like instead of a mediation, if it seemed like a circle could be a good option, I would ask people if they'd be into it. And I just started, learning, failing, trying again. And I just really got into it. It like lit something within me that propelled me on. And I was just working really hard and starting, I got some resources at Seeds to start the RJ program there. And then I was able to start to build some pilot, programs at Juvenile Hall and Berkeley, Oakland, that kind of stuff. I just got lit, and I've actually been lit about RJ ever since then. I really love it.
Yeah. To spell it out like really specifically for people, like what is the difference between restorative justice and mediation?
I see mediation can be restorative. I see it as it can be under sort of the RJ umbrella, I guess. Mediation is a specific facilitated way of, and by the way, there's lots of ways to do mediation, including very directive, which is what a lot of lawyers do, or even evaluative, where the mediator's like, okay, I've heard from everybody, here's what's going to happen, right? Like a judge might do. But the style of mediation that we used was called facilitative, which is basically creating a space, allowing the parties to come to some understanding and work some things through. And so, but, oftentimes like a relationship wasn't repaired. It didn't really contain all the impacted parties or members of the community. It didn't have tendrils out into other aspects. It was just very focused on this one particular conflict or this issue. And so it's also highly, the power balance is different, because in mediation, the power sits with the facilitator, the mediator, and it's triangulated through them to the parties. They are very much facilitating this dialogue. And in restorative justice and circle process, that the power balance is leveled in such a way that that's not the case. I think if done right. I mean, it can definitely, I've seen a lot of circles and probably even ones that I've done that where I made sure that the power sat with me, because that's my comfort zone, because I come from a mediation thing. And so I try to be conscious when I do circle to not have that happen and try to just create a space and then kind of sit back and let the power get shared or, experience that.
Mediation is about like solving problems, not necessarily like attending to like underlying relationship issues. And like restorative justice, talk about being in right relationship. Whether or not those relationships exist in the first place, we can help to build those proactively or in efforts to repair. And then like the power balance that you spoke to, right? So much more power. Like even though with mediation, you're getting people, the goal is to get people to like come to decisions that everyone's on board with. There is an element of power over as opposed to power with. And I think like restorative justice in some aspects like will take more time, right? Depending on those things, depending on the factors, depending on the relationship involved, depending on, lots of different factors. But I guess like, what is it about restorative justice that you were like, mediation is great. That's something that's like in my tool bag. This is something that like I can lean on. But when you like devoted a lot of your energy, a lot of your organizational resources towards this work, like you've been on fire for it. What was it about restorative justice that made that it for you?
I think that it was probably just experiencing it and seeing how powerful it was, even just a community building circle, like and the ability for people to share deeply, like how the process can create. I've always seen it as like a crucible for relationships. Like it's almost, you can't help but bond with the other people in a circle. And I noticed that people would allow themselves to be vulnerable and then not regret it afterwards, which I have seen in other kind of processes. Witnessing transformation around harm and conflict, transformation in relationships, transformation in people's own selves, transformation in as a circle keeper, understanding myself better. And because I think, to be a good circle keeper, you really have to hold up the mirror and understand yourself and do that work. It's really important. So it had more depth. It allowed for further investigation, for understanding of, the harm that caused the harm, that kind of thing, or what makes people tick, what motivates people, and not just problem solving. And I think mediation, oftentimes I'll do a circle with a group of people and a mediation will kind of come out of it. Like It'll be clear that a mediation needs to happen between 2 or 3 people. And sometimes I'll be doing prep with a group, like staff at a school or an organization, and it'll be clear that we need to do this mediation before we can come together in a circle, right? So, I can see it. I see it as a tool really that can be used before, after, I guess sometimes I've probably even done it during, put the talking piece down and just went for it in the middle of a circle just because it felt right at the time. When I first started learning circle, I kind of learned things in a purist sense. When I learn something, I try to be a purist about it. Yeah. But what I learned pretty quickly was like, I started doing everything in a circle. Staff meetings were in a circle. Every meeting was in a circle. Everything in a circle. And, realized after a couple of years of doing that that's actually not the best use of.
Not everything has to be a circle. No.
Not everything has to be a circle. Some things, so when it comes to mediation, like, not every thing has to be a circle. Sometimes it's a mediation that's necessary, a more facilitated dialogue between people to work out a specific thing. And then we can get back to the larger community and the stakeholders and maybe a bigger harm or something more deeper that's happening,
Yeah, I resonate with that a lot. Not that I had the platform to like all of these meetings are necessarily going to be circle, but like there was this time when I first learned this was like, peacemaking circles, like it's just like the circle way that you have to be. And I think like it's important to distinguish between like work that is restorative and like formal processes, right? A restorative way of being versus like, I'm going to pass a talking piece. You can pass like a talking, like there's this book called Talking Stick by Stephen Beyer. And he talks about, in your day-to-day actions and your day-to-day relationships, it's not that you're like physically carrying a talking piece or a talking stick and like, all right, here we're going to pass it, but like the way that you move and embody listening deeply, not just to the people, the words that they're saying, but your environment and the things around you, like helps you live in that. He doesn't use the word restorative. This book is written from like an indigenous spiritual peacemaking tradition. He doesn't use the word restorative justice, but like doing this work, living your life in that kind of way is how we embody this work, even if we're not like, sitting in the circle with a centerpiece and talking piece and values and a candle and a plant and some water in the center.
My friend who used to work at OUSD with me, and RJ, who now does consulting, his name's Arnaldo Garcia. And has always said, the goal of circle is to be in circle when you're not in circle.
Yeah.
And that, to me, that kind of piggybacks on what you just said, that you build that community in circle so that when you're not in circle, you maintain that, that vibe or that way of being. And that's really the goal of all the work that we're doing is to create that, to spread the philosophy and way of being rather than, follow this curriculum or something like that.
Yeah, I was going to make this transition a little bit later, but like this seems like a good segue. Like you talked about like your background as a musician, right? And that being something that like has been helpful for you as a circle keeper. At the NACRJ conference, you ran this session about John Coltrane as a circle keeper, right? I'm curious like how you made that connection in your life and like specific, like just to like being a musician and doing circle work, but like the application to Coltrane and how you've, shared those ideas with folks as you've taught this work.
I mean, I love John Coltrane. I love his music. It makes me, it's some of the only music I can listen to that just instantly will make me weep or like have ecstatic, feelings. It really speaks to me. But I should say I am a musician and I've played professionally and toured and recorded and it's a part of who I am. I'm a musician. I like to play music and I play guitar and sing. But I also love to do, mediation and restorative justice circles. And I kind of just, saw them as two parts of myself. There's other parts of myself too. I love photography as well. I did professional photography for a long time. And I'm sure I'll do a workshop at some point weaving music, photography, and restorative justice together. But there's different aspects of myself that give me, life, and music and restorative justice and conflict resolution are two of those things, and they existed like side by side or like concurrently. And I would, I would be doing mediations, I would be doing circles, and then I'd be playing music, and they never really met, But what is it about all of that speaks to me and that feeds something within me? And so the more I did this work, the more I would just get like these little inklings about how they were similar. I think the first way that popped in my mind was the ability to improvise and be comfortable with improvisation. And also what improvisate, like the amount of practice that it takes to be able to improvise in the moment, right? It's not just something you just do. It takes a lot of work. And one of the things that you hear about John Coltrane is that he practiced nonstop. People would hear him. There's stories of people, saying that they would hear him in his hotel room running basic do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do scales, over and over and over, or the minor like modal scales, just over and over and over again, playing with them, picking them up, picking them apart, turning them upside down, inside out, but still very basic scales, because then when he actually played with people, that allowed him to improvise. And I feel like that connected with restorative justice, and with conflict resolution, the ability to have a structure, yet within that structure be flexible enough and okay enough to leave it if that's where it needs to go.
Yeah.
And I think of a lot of jazz music, especially bop, which I love, bebop, which Coltrane played a lot of, but he also played other types of jazz. But bebop tends to have a structure where there'll be a head, and which is like the main melody, then there's like this improvisational part where people turns playing, and then it comes back to the head and it's out, or it might come back, improvise again, and then go out. And I see circle a lot like that, where you've got this structure, you're setting a set, you're building relationships, you're creating some shared values together, you are working on how you want to be together, but then you step off the ledge and you blow and you just see where it goes. And so that was probably the first element. But then I started thinking about it. I'm like, well, what other elements of music, and not just music, but being like a playing in a band, connect with this work? And so I started thinking about like dissonance, like the use of dissonance, which is for those of you who, some folks might not understand what dissonance is, but in music, dissonance is something that sounds, I guess the easiest way to describe it is it just sounds like not right, like something's off. Like it's not necessarily the opposite of harmony, because you can have dissonant harmony, but it just, like the theme from Jaws, something that may provide a scary feeling, or something that feels wrong, something that's maybe someone might be a little slightly flat, So that happens all the time in circle, right? Where something is just, you've got to work on something or dig into something so that this dissonance could then resolve, something that's not being said, something that needs to be uncovered. The use of silence, space, Miles Davis famously talked about playing the spaces
between the notes.
And if you think of the notes between the space between the notes, like the tension that can be created. I love reggae music too. And reggae is so amazing at the space between the bass and the rhythm, the drums and the bass. It can create that tension. And so, I mean, there's so many connections, and so I've been thinking about this for a really long time. And eventually I was like, maybe I should really like sit down and see if I can put together some kind of workshop, I was able to do that at the conference, and it went well. And it made me just want to keep pursuing it. And there's a lot of the things that the audience said that struck them during it I hadn't even thought of, that how it hit them. Like we would listen to a Coltrane piece and, listen to how he would revisit a theme, which constantly happens in mediation. It happens in circle too. But in mediation, you're looking for themes. And the way I like to think about it is you separate them from the people, right? Like you don't want to be focusing on the people as much as what the problem is, and themes might arise. And I'm a visual kind of person. So I visually place the theme or the problem, like literally like about 2 feet above the center of the table. And I just feel like I'm just like flipping it around, almost like it's a holograph, that you can move around like board or something. You can flip it around and look at it, look under it, look above it, peel it apart, and really dig into this theme. And then you might digress and you head down some path, and then you'll revisit that theme. And if you listen to Coltrane, especially on A Love Supreme, his masterwork, his homage to the Great Spirit, he does that. And so I played about a minute and a half of Acknowledgement, part 2. That's the piece. And you could hear him. He had the same, 3 notes that he would just investigate in a million different ways. And then he'd venture off, on some tangent, some digression. And then he would come back and revisit those notes. And I was just like, my God, this is just like how I do, conflict resolution, or, and so I named it John Coltrane Circle Keeper, because I wanted to lift him up as an example of how music, being a good band leader, could also be the same skills necessary, or that would be helpful to be a good circle keeper. And the last one is also just understanding what I call the psychic space, like what's the space of like the body language everything but the words, the energy, where people are sitting, how they're representing themselves, what they say when it comes to them, how, all the unspoken. I call that the psychic space. And when you play music with other people, that's a huge part of playing together. And when you've been in a band for a long time, there's communication between you that is psychic in nature, that's energetic, that's not spoken, and it's hard to explain, but that's the same thing you need when you're keeping a circle, to be able to kind of feel that and open yourself up to that. The first one I would listen to is Giant Steps, the song Giant Steps, because to me, that is the how they lay out that song, to me, is like Circle. The intro sounds like, to me, it sounds like coming together, working how are we going to be together? And then he steps off into this improvisational piece. And then, and it's pretty straightforward bop jazz. And to me, I like it as and you have to stretch your mind for this. You have to open yourself up to expanding your concept of what, restorative justice is, right? Like, because it's a stretch, and you got to kind of like go with it, right? So, but to me, Giant Steps is there's other examples, but that one's a good one to just start, listen to Giant Steps and think of it as a circle and see what comes up for you, right? And another one, the piece that I played where he would investigate a theme is, I think it's Acknowledgement Part 2. And I think I even went from like 1 minute to like 2 minutes in or something. I played that little, it might have been right there, but you can hear him and, work with a melody, and he just exhausts that melody. Like and it's literally like 3 notes, ba-da-ba, he's like ba-da-ba, 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 and he's just like figuring this thing out, what it is, digging into it, and then he'll, go off. And so, but the whole album like that, A Love Supreme, is pretty amazing album. And it's not, some people it's hard to access because he goes on some pretty astral planes, but there's parts of that album that are like stunning in his ability to latch onto a theme, and the theme is usually some melody that really you want to keep hearing over and over,
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, and even like as you're talking, like, hey, what are the themes? Like, hey, what are the values? What are the agreements that we're going to express over and over to make sure that we're coming back to like being this way together? It's so many things. As you were talking, my mind went in so many directions. I don't know if you've ever seen this YouTube video. I think it's Wired that puts out like Expert Explains, and they had Jacob Collier and Herbie Hancock talking about harmony, right? And they're like, there's the simple harmony, like, just like the third note above of the first, but like all the like 5 different layers of like minor, diminished, and I don't have my music theory down enough to be able to like fully express the things that they were talking about, where when you were talking about dissonance, right? Like things that might seem dissonant, like things that are like 4.5 steps apart, right? Can be connected and made part of that whole. And so when somebody says something that's out of line from what you, as somebody who had like gone into that circle with a plan, had like, like that was relevant to that person, and so that's probably relevant to what's going on in this space, and it all belongs, and you can always find the way to make it back home, like, or to the root note in that YouTube video. The other thing that I was thinking about is are musicians like Snarky Puppy or like Dirty Loops, who like take like these, well, I mean, I think different approaches, right? Like Snarky Puppy, modern jazz group that like has the most complex rhythms and like constantly changing time signatures. And like when you're talking about like working in concert with a group of people, like the ability to listen and make those alterations as you move together just takes hours and hours and hours and hours and hours of time together, right? And that like the relationship building, in order to be able to take on these like enormous task, like if you were like to sight read that music, right, like would be really tough. But like when you put in hours of work, both like as an individual on your own craft, but then like as a collaborative on this thing that you're working on together, you can achieve great things. So many connections. What else was present for you?
Oh my, so there's three things, and I don't even know if I'll be able to remember. The first one is, you can look up a drawing that John Coltrane gave Yusef Lateef, and it's a circle. It's the circle of fists, but it's so much more esoteric than that. Right. And it just can, for me, it's like the physical manifestation of what I'm talking about. Like, he gave this and he didn't even really describe it. Like, nobody knows. I've read articles about it, like very scholarly, articles about it. Nobody really knows what it means, except for that it has something to do with the circle of fists. But it's this beautiful drawing that he gave him. So you can look that up and check it out. And the other thing is, dissonance is cultural, right? There's a cultural. So I played during the workshop, I played some Bulgarian folk music by a band called Kitka. And to the Western ear, it's like something is wrong. Something is wrong about this, So, but I find it beautiful, and it is harmonic. And obviously in Bulgaria, they find it beautiful as well, because it's their music. But to the Western ear, and I played it, and I saw people in the audience like almost tilt their head, how like just tilt their head, like, ooh, something's flat, something's not right. So what one culture or person might find beautiful, another might find dissonant. So there's also a cultural relevance there. And I think that's also relates to circle too. So the part about polyrhythms and coming together and creating rhythm as a community. And I feel like there's a human need for rhythm. And what I did at the workshop is I learned this game from some middle schoolers in Oakland. And it involves little stones, like little rocks, like maybe about this size, and or smaller. And what I did was I brought 12 of these stones or rocks and I got 6 volunteers, and I had them stand around a table, and I had them each have 2 rocks in front of them. And it's called grab, click, pass. And I learned this from students, middle schoolers. And I just counted them down, but I didn't do it in a timing so that they could follow my timing. I just said 3, 2, 1, right? And you grab the stones, you click them together, and then you pass them to the person to the right of you, and you put them down in front of that person. And what happened was, you grab, you click, you pass. Mm-hmm. Grab, you click, you pass. What happened is it starts out very polyrhythmic and not cohesive, and everybody is kind of figuring it out for themselves. They're operating as an individual within this larger organism, but yet they're not aware yet of the larger organism. And then eventually people start to realize, like, oh, wait a minute, there can be a rhythm here, like the bang on the table, and then the click, and then the bang on the table again, right? And eventually, every single time, a rhythm is formed out of chaos, out of seeming chaos, and it's because the individual becomes aware of the group, and they become part of a larger, like a machine or an organism, something that's more holistic and bigger than them, and their consciousness expands to that. And it's so cool to be a part of and to do, but also to witness, to see it happen. And I just, I see that as related to circle as well.
When you're as lit about restorative justice, or when you have this orientation to the world, you see the connections in so many places. You see the places where it's like, oh man, I wish those 2 people like knew this way. Like you wish that all the time. I'm curious, and like I fully acknowledge, like we haven't even started to talk about like specifically your work in Oakland Unified School District. I'm curious, before we get there, like as you've moved through the world as a person, like, yes, as a musician, but like as a parent, a partner, a friend, a community member, how has this way of being, both like with this restorative justice lens, the circle keeper lens, how has that impacted your relationships in a way that like wasn't present before you knew this work?
Mm-hmm. I was bullied really badly when I was in my freshman year of high school and sophomore year. Really, humiliated, beaten up, just the worst kind of bullying. No help from any adults, nobody at the school, no adults. And I think I like resolved to myself after I experienced that I would just try and be nice to people and try and, honestly, to try and be nice and to do right, to do the right thing. And it's not that restorative justice made me feel like I want to be that way. I think me feeling that way made me want to do restorative justice.
Mm.
And so I think now, having been doing restorative justice, especially in Oakland at Oakland Unified School District, it's provided different lenses for me. Definitely the lens, a racial justice lens of being a white person, especially in this work, trying to understand how my whiteness impacts everywhere I go, every environment I'm in, and to try and be aware and conscious of that out in the world, as well as my sense of community. And my sense of community, there's like this small community that is like my family and close friends. And then there's like larger and larger communities, but I see everything as being in a community, and what needs to happen to maintain that community, and what needs to happen to provide healing so that we can move forward, and I think of that on a national level, on an international scale. And so I think it's impacted me in that way. And I also just think that, like, and this is more of a sort of just a wisp of a thought, but like, I think something about just being in circle a lot, it just impacts you. It's like somehow it connects to the systems within your body. And I think it's just healthy for you. It's like a holistic medicine, that nobody quite understands how it works, but it does.
You said you think about this at a national level.
Yeah.
How do you see this work as a way forward, as a way to heal?
I would say to you that I think we actually are in an armed conflict with one of the sides having guns.
Sure.
And these folks who are sort of, quote, lone gunmen are actually, unwittingly or unwittingly soldiers for the far right white supremacists. That was not a Freudian slip. So I would submit that we probably are already in some form of civil war, which is a really scary thought. So the question then is about what needs to happen. And yeah, we are so far caught up in this us versus them binary right now that it's going to take a long time to walk it down. But I think what really needs to happen is truth and healing, and truth before healing, but truth and healing. And you've heard of truth and reconciliation. The reconciliation can happen, but right now we need truth and healing. And nothing is going to happen with this country, I don't think, in terms of moving forward together, unless we do that truth and healing bit. And I'm talking specifically around slavery and genocide of Native peoples, and what we did with Japanese folks during World War II in terms of internment, and all the harms that have been done to people, genocides and exclusion, that kind of thing. And we see the results, in our education system. We see it in our criminal justice system. And we're going to keep seeing those results unless we do some truth and healing. And that's really the only thing I think of. And it's going to be a long process, but it needs to happen. There needs to be some storytelling. Storytelling is healing. And it's the only thing that has been, as long as humans have been humans, that we've done to provide community healing. And it still works. We just need to embrace it and do it. But, how that's going to happen in a large scale, I don't know. It's definitely happening in smaller pockets.
To what degree are we relying on white people to convince other white people to like humanize not white people? Right.
Well, I mean, Fania Davis in her book, Race, the Little Book of Race and Restorative Justice, which I always keep like an arm's reach away. Mm-hmm. She says, white people of today did not create the mess that we're in, but, benefit from it, and therefore are responsible for, correcting it and not leaving the onus on people of color to do that. And so I agree with her on that. And so white people have a job to do. And so that part, I actually do agree with that. White people have a job to do, but a lot of white people don't know that yet, or care enough to want to do the work to do that, because the whole part about being white is you don't have to do that. We live in a capitalist society, right? It's a military, prison, industrial complex that we all have and that we exist within. And so, what makes change, or what motivates people within a system like ours? Well, it's money, right? It's the bottom line. And so when you see change in our society these days, it's usually because you just follow the money, and it's the money that, Like when our prison systems went from like state facilities to corporate privatized prisons, it was because people made money doing that. And so the only way at this point to like make that change to, something better would be to somehow make it profitable, right, within this capitalist system, while also working, like what I was saying earlier, around truth and healing. And that's unfortunate, but capitalism is responsible for, if not all of the pain and suffering that was experiencing it, for a lot of it.
Is that is that how you think like the argument for getting restorative justice into Oakland Unified School District went down, right? Because like people weren't necessarily like all the way like altruistic about like, yeah, we should just do this because we should do this, right?
You might say yes, because there was really not an argument for getting it into OUSD. It came in grassroots. It came in from community stealthily and as a legacy of the work the Black Panthers were doing. And so therefore it had some sustainability and some staying power, and people were able to connect to it in a way different than if the superintendent said, hey, I went to a conference, heard about this thing, we're going to do this now, right? It came in from grassroots. It was supported by Restorative Justice for Oakland Youth and others, and made its way into the school district that way. But to answer your question, what people noticed after the first 3 years of, one or two schools doing it is that suspensions went down, expulsions went down, referrals for violence went down. People dealt with things as a community rather than as hyper individualistic. And so that kind of success is the kind of thing that school districts want to see, suspensions going down, that kind of thing. And so if you want to liken that to, what's the bottom line? The bottom line is school districts want to see suspensions go down. What's going to work to do that? Okay, if RJ has done that, then that's when there was some initial success at Cole Middle School in West Oakland. The superintendent at the time, Tony Smith, said, let's embrace this, because look what happened at this school. Some amazing things happened. And so that's how it kind of came in. And that's what made the district kind of take notice and decide to embrace it as a strategy. So in that sense, that, yeah, it's, it touched on what the district sees as the bottom line. It might not have been money necessarily, although I'm sure somewhere, if you dig deep enough, money's, tied to that, and suspensions and all that.
No, I think that's one helpful context. Thanks for sharing like the short version of that story. But when I think about like, what is the incentive for schools wanting to continue to engage in this work? The timeline's going to be messed up on this, but like this week I posted on Instagram, and I've been thinking a lot about, when we're going in to teach this work to people who are not given this in their teacher training, right? Like restorative justice is not a part of teacher training beyond like, hey, here's this 2-hour thing. In most universities, and I'll say like, I think all universities except for like Eastern Mennonite universities, like teacher education program. And if somebody's listening to this and they're like, hey, no, my school is doing this and doing this with depth, like, please let me know so I can stop saying that. And I can like champion somebody else who's doing this work on that level. But people aren't coming in with this orientation through their teacher training, right? We all grew up, most of us grew up in a schooling system that was rooted in punishment, and of course, white supremacy as behavior control. And so when we're asking people to, one, at an institutional level, embrace this work, slow down so we can like learn these steps, learn these notes, learn how to play, and then learn how to play together, right? We get hit with like, oh, we don't have time for that, right? Or like there are, and it's not that like necessarily that like people don't want to learn this. It's like we have like 18 other competing priorities. Like, how do we make this something that people want? I think there's one way that I know different places have tried, like, okay, so you get grant money for doing this, you have this grant position, and then like that funding runs out, and then where is that school left with these practices when they're relying on this? I don't know that there's like a clear like question, but as somebody who's been doing this work at a district level and has been on the ground in schools, like, how do you see the trajectory of this work, both in Oakland in your context, and I know you've been in conversation and with people across the country, like where are we in this space and time with restorative justice in schools?
Yeah, it is hard to do this in an institution because the institution in many ways abhors it, like resists it with everything it has, because the homeostasis, like where it finds balance is in oppression and harm, unfortunately, based on the history of the institution. And I think a couple things. One is those of us who do RJ in an institution have to model it. We have to be RJ when we go to schools, when we talk with people. We have to show that there's another way. There's a way to be relational and not transactional within this institution. So just simply that is helpful. And also, restorative justice is not another thing that we're trying to get people to do. And you ask any, so many teacher leaders, like people who've been teaching for a while, who other teachers look up to,
Yeah.
they've told me, like, I've kind of been doing this already. It may not be like how you described it. It may not be maybe using a talking piece, or maybe we won't sit in a circle, or maybe we didn't talk about values and stuff. But the idea of creating the environment for learning before teaching and learning can happen, creating a welcoming, caring, dare I say, loving environment that's relational in the classroom, while also maintaining some expectations and having systems and rituals and traditions, that people understand. They'll say that, this is, you've kind of put a word to something that a way of being that I've already been. And it's their relationships with other teachers that look up to them that is the leverage for moving this forward at a school. Because if I think luckily it's the teacher leaders that tend to embrace it first, and other teachers who are maybe newer, who are looking to them to figure out how to best create their classroom environment, they can influence them. And so we never force people to do RJ. We never mandate it. One of our principles is participation must be voluntary. That's one of our foundational principles. And so, and that, to me, that's like just like alleviates the stress of trying to convince people about RJ. Like, we just do it. We get people to experience it, because experience really precedes belief when it comes to RJ, meaning you have to kind of just be in it to understand what it is. We just do it, one circle at a time. We build our relationships. We work with the early adopters, with the people who are like, yes, please give me this, help me, coach me, support me. And we work with them. And then I've seen people do a 180. I've seen administrators be like, I thought this was BS. I thought this was just coddling kids. I thought it was just hollow apologies, all the low-hanging fruit that people that don't understand what RJ is pick when they say why they don't like it. And then I've seen them get into a circle, witness transformation right before their eyes, and be like, oh, I get it now. I get it. Can I get trained in this? That kind of thing. And I've seen that a number of times.
Can I get trained in this? Like, often when I hear that, it's like, can I get trained in like facilitating this process? Right. Mm-hmm. Like, how do you make the connection for like, yes, process, but also way of being?
Yeah. Well, number one, I think we've never developed a curriculum on purpose. We have all kinds of tools. If you go to our website, we got hella tools, navigational tools, I'll call them, posters, question rings, circle templates, videos, things that help people understand what it is, implementation guides. We just released an elementary toolkit for elementary teachers and people in elementary school, whole school and peer RJ for elementary. Just last week, we released that. So we don't have this, here's the thing, just follow it. And eventually what happens with that is it gets, put back up on the shelf, right? And I've seen that happen with some good, like conflict resolution, things like Second Step and tribes and things that are useful. But when the money runs out, they get put up on the shelf, and it's a curriculum and stuff. So I've been pressured a lot to come up with a curriculum, and we've resisted that and instead provide these other resources. And then in our trainings, people walk away with a couple things. Like, they walk away having experienced a circle for sure. It's like literally the first thing before we even talk about what RJ is. They're sitting in circle, start to finish, opening the closing, and experiencing the power of it. Even just a community building circle, extremely can be very powerful. They're going to understand what RJ is. They're going to understand how we roll it out in OUSD. They're going to hopefully walk away with an understanding of, this is how we're asking you to be something as well as to do something. And we can help you. We'll help you do that. But it's a shift in how we typically are in our culture. And so we support people in embracing that kind of, working with rather than doing to involving stakeholders in decisions that impact them, having a racial justice lens, having a healing centered approach, all those things. And we do that without giving people that curriculum. And so they don't have that one thing that people are used to relying on, which is kind of like a way out, because all you have to do is open up to page 1 and follow, do this, debrief that, show this, debrief that, wait for the bell. And so since they don't have the curriculum to rely on, they have to really deeply engage with, well, what does this mean for me? And what does this mean for me as a human in this environment, in this system, and in my classroom with these young people?
Yeah, I mean, back to our music analogies, right? Like things like, the question sheets and those like tools, those toys, if you will, can like be like the scales for, foundations, like things to like to refer back to like as practice. But, actually practicing and actually being this way, like listening and getting those reps in is what helps build practitioners, not just people who are asking a different set of questions. Right. Anybody can ask those restorative questions right now. And the space and the ability to like hold that space, the ability to like build those relationships, know who you are and how that impacts the folks that you come in contact with, like that is what is going to determine whether or not you're like somebody who's like just reading the sheet music and playing it straight, or like making it a masterpiece.
Mm-hmm. And it's also about flexing that muscle, building the muscle memory, and practice. That's what practicing is. Like if you're learning a piece of music, you're not going to be stellar the first time you play it. You have to practice it. You have to get the nuance, the feeling, the timbre, all that that comes with practicing it. And it's the same thing with circle. Like I tell teachers, or anybody for that matter, I'm like, don't expect this to work at first. Like expect failure, but be patient, be persistent, keep doing it, and eventually everybody will understand how different it is than what we're normally used to, and also see how great it is, because people will be empowered by it. You know what I mean? And that's what I've seen at school after school, is that it often won't go well at first, especially with adults. Like adults are uncomfortable. They walk into a room, chairs are in a circle. They're just like, oh my God, like, I don't want to deal with this with my colleagues. Students have a little bit less experience than that because they don't have all that baggage that we do as adults.
Hey, this isn't schoolwork.
And we play games. One thing
we
do in USD, we play a lot of games in our circles. We make them fun. And play, as Albert Einstein said, is the highest form of research, right? I mean, that's where you really understand your boundaries and how to resolve conflict and what you like and don't like. And so we do a lot of play, movement, games, that kind of thing. But let's see, where was I going with that? But it takes practice. And oftentimes people, they'll speak out of turn, they'll get up, they'll roll around on the floor, kids. And it might not be engaging to them. Maybe we're asking a question that we care about, but not anything that the students will care about, So, but eventually, if you're persistent, it'll work.
Yeah. What I want folks to take away is that, yeah, you're right. But like when I was a kid, like I hated piano lessons. Like, so I would do my lesson, but like I wouldn't practice and like go back and just like, oh, I don't know this music. And the teacher's like, well, did you practice? Right. It's like, no, like, how are you expecting to get better? And like, you're not gonna play it right the very first time, or the second, third, fourth, fifth. Like, I think to your point, like there are people who are like maybe more naturally inclined to being this way, and it does take practice to build these skills. What else do you want to say about restorative justice in schools and in general, or OUSD, before we transition to the questions that everybody answers?
That we aren't going to give up trying to make this change. I've definitely had some people tell me, like, David, you're fighting a losing battle trying to change an institution, even one as progressive as, in Oakland, where we have an Office of Equity, where we have a director of anti-racist curriculum, where, we do restorative justice, even as a place as progressive as Oakland can be, people just say, you're wasting your time. You're not going to do it. And I just, I can't believe that. I have to believe that, we are going to make a change, and it's going to take a long time, probably, could be generations, but we have to ignite that spark at some point. And so district-wide restorative justice, it may appear like that it's not going to work or that it doesn't work. And there's so many reasons for that. One is the systems in place are so punitive. And so to try and change them takes time. A lot of times there's laws that forbid you from, using restorative justice. Like if someone violates one of the big five, which are the five infractions that have to be sent to expulsion, and other systems in place that make it really hard to do RJ. But we have to keep at it. We have to keep making the change. The other thing that's difficult is churn, teacher churn, principal churn. There's so much turnover, but we just keep training the new teachers, and hopefully the teachers that stay and the principals that stay will continue to do this work. And slowly but surely you make a change. And then the one thing I haven't spent a lot of time talking about, but perhaps is one of the most important things that we've done, is around youth engagement, training and supporting youth and embracing restorative justice. It's in my work, there's nothing more beautiful than witnessing that. It's kind of what, if you would ask me what keeps me going, that I would say that's it. Things that I hadn't even thought of before when it comes to restorative justice. So I learn a lot from them, and I just find their embracing of it so beautiful. And at the same time, it takes a lot of work to support youth in a youth development framework around restorative justice. It's not just about training them in RJ. Supporting youth to do RJ takes a lot of prep work, support while they're doing it, debriefing with them afterwards. It takes commitment from adults.
Yeah.
But when you look at who's at the district the longest, it's usually the students, not the adults. They come and go.
Yeah.
There for 12 years or so, if they're there the entire time. And so just from a programmatic model in terms of sustainability, I know the best practice, technically is, changing adult behavior and working with adults. At the same time, I've seen a lot of youth drive the adult behavior. The youth engagement in RJ can drive adults to do it.
Yeah. I mean, I would say like caveat, assuming that there is like still like the infrastructure for those youth to be supported.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
There needs to be at least one adult ally that can work with. You can't have a PRJ program at a school that I've seen work where there isn't an adult that it's their responsibility to do it,
Yeah. And for the people who may be listening to this, like, oh, like, how can I start these programs for young people in the school? Like, please don't start there.
Right.
Right. It is so much easier for young people to embrace this work, but like you can't put them in the position of doing this in a situation, in an environment that's not like conducive or like where they will be supported in doing this work. But yeah, to your point about like, them being some like oftentimes at schools longer than like adults, schools definitely, and like in the district as well. I like to think about the adult work that we do, not just as like for the purpose of this school. Amplify, like I'm not in the position that you are in, right? Amplify RJ comes into schools and supports like adult learning for the most part. Of course, we have our public facing things where adults come and learn. But when I think about going in and supporting adults doing this work in schools, like there's always this acknowledgement in the back of my mind that like this work is probably not going to take root in all of the highest aspirations that we have for restorative justice in this institution. The institution is not built for this. People can make those individual choices. Mm-hmm. And so for me, the goal is like, how do we help people have this like liberatory experience, right? Mm-hmm. So like wherever they go, they're taking this with them, right? Hopefully like in the time that they're at the school, they're in an environment where they can help develop their practice with the people who they've learned alongside, but like they're also able to take this with them, not only to their next job, but like when they go home, right? In the communities that they participate in. Like this podcast is called like This Restorative Justice Life, not like This Restorative Justice Teacher, This Restorative Justice Principal, This Restorative Justice social emotional learning person, right? Like to all of what we said, like this is who we are. And if the school happens to be the place that you learned about it,
I agree with you 100%.
I want to make a transition into the questions that everybody answers when they come on the podcast. We've talked around it, but in your own words, define restorative justice.
It all comes back to community. We want to create the community to that we want to restore to. Right now, the community in our institutions and in our society is not something that's worth restoring to, because it's based in oppression and racism. And so first and foremost, we have to create that community to restore to, so that when we have the conversations around restoration or harm, conflict, healing, that we can restore to something that's positive and based in relationships. And so to me, restorative justice is about community, and we have to connect with community as we do this work. Schools are notoriously insular places. They can feel like they can exist in a vacuum, and it can be difficult in a school district to reach out to community, but we make a point and always do that. So I could, if you ask me in an hour from now, I probably have a completely different answer, but restorative justice to me is about, it emanates from community, and it's just very different than our way of being in this hyper individualistic society. It's about the collective well-being. And yeah, there's a part about harm and justice and, repairing harm and doing that in a way that is non-punitive. But for me, it's, I'm feeling the community aspect right now.
As you've practiced this work, and I'll leave this work as broad as you want to answer this question, what's been an oh shit moment, and what did you learn from it?
Restorative justice is this beautiful, holistic thing. It's a holistic philosophy with a set of practices, right? And one of the ways that we scaffold it in education is on these 3 tiers. And I admit that I think the word tier sounds carceral to me, right? Because prison tiers, right? But we broke it into these 3 tiers along this multi-tiered system of support, or what used to be called response to intervention, because it's an educational framework that teachers understand. And we realized early on that anything we can do to connect this so that teachers, it's easier for them to understand, is better, right? So we started to create some tools for teachers, things that connected to things they already know, like social emotional learning and things like that. And this MTSS, multi-tier system of support, is that thing that teachers understand and educators understand. Tier 1 being everybody, tier 2 being small groups, and tier 3 being the individual. And so we scaffolded our RJ work on this 3-tier models. And when we did that, we noticed just the uptake, amount of people understanding it and doing it increased dramatically, because teachers realized, oh, tier 1, that's my thing. Like, I just need to focus on that, and it made sense. And so we started to scaffold like our trainings in this way, but still we would describe RJ sort of as this holistic, system or model. But when you talk about the oh shit moment, I had probably about 5 years ago, when I was like, oh shit, I wonder if the thousands of people that we've trained, if you were to ask them to define restorative justice, if they would go to define it in terms of 3 tiers. And the answer is probably like, yeah, actually. Unfortunately, I think a lot of people, when I talk about the 3 tiers, in our trainings, I don't think I did a good enough job making them realize, like, hey, this is just a framework for scaffolding. It doesn't even exist outside of the school district. Like, most people don't talk about tiers in the community or the criminal justice system. It's like a way to scaffold it in schools. And I don't think I did a good enough job at first at explaining that. I always make sure and do it now. But I had this oh shit moment when I was like, oh no, a lot of people that we've trained are probably defining RJ in terms of 3 tiers.
Yeah.
And really, it's just an easy way to describe it so people can understand it in education. It's just a framework.
Yeah. That as you were describing that, I was waiting for like the hammer to drop. Like, yes, you want to contextualize it, but like, we don't want people to like limit it to this context.
It's very Western to compartmentalize things and to not view things as holistic. And so I really hesitated at first when we started to kind of do this scaffolding. I was like, well, this kind of goes against like what I think of in terms of RJ. It's once again, we're starting to box things up, But when I noticed the impact of it, I kind of decided to go with it because educators, it made it like understandable in a way that I hadn't seen them understand it before. Before they would be like, this philosophy, how do I do it? Like, I get it. I understand it. I like it. I like the training, but I don't know how this impacts, like, I don't know how to do it in my class, And so now I'm very clear in the trainings. I'm like, look, I'm talking about 3 tiers right now. This is not how you define restorative justice. This is just a simple framework for you to understand how we do it in schools. And please don't go out defining RJ as, well, there's 3 tiers and that's what RJ is, because it's not.
Yeah. Yeah. When you're doing this work within the context of schools, like, what are because you have such limited time, like, hey, we have these 2, 3, 4, maybe we have this whole day for professional development. How are you helping people make the connections to like the outside application to this work when you're so focused on like, hey, I want you to like create community agreements with like your students and like do this thing collaboratively instead of like, these are classroom rules and if you break them, you're out?
Yeah. That's a great question. I think my thinking on it is that it happens naturally for people, is that they start to make the connections in their own life. Many people are connected to organizations, things that they, outside of, groups that they belong to, and they start to make those connections. Students as well.
Yeah.
I've had a lot of students tell me they, pick up a talking piece at their home now because they saw their 2 brothers fighting or something. And so I think people begin to make the connections. And also, one thing I think that's really important about RJ is that, in institutions or even in like our businesses, a lot of times people are put on this professional front. And I really encourage people to be leaders that allow themselves to be present in the space. Like this thing about music, for example, like John Coltrane, like I talk about that a lot, as a way to describe RJ, like, hey, when people tell me, oh, I've already taken that training, I don't need to go to an RJ 101 anymore. I'm like, well, actually, you should never stop going to RJ 101s because John Coltrane never stopped practicing the basics, And so I try to bring things that I like into the space, things about who I am, what I enjoy outside of my work environment, and be a full human being in this space. And I think when people see that, when they see the other people that I work with doing RJ do that as well, it models for them. And then they feel that they can do that. Like they can bring who they are into the space, not just as the professional, like I'm a math teacher, but like I'm a math teacher who also makes kombucha, or, loves to garden or plays clarinet or works with this nonprofit, and so they can bring that into the school, and then they can bring the RJ work that they're doing in school out to those, so that there's this like free flowing, energetic thing happening.
Yeah. Yeah. Love it. This question's hard in a different way.
Okay.
You get to sit in circle with 4 people, dead or alive. Who are they? And what is the question you ask the circle?
Oh my God. 2 of them have to probably be Bob Marley and Nelson Mandela. Bob Marley, because he's just influenced me a lot, and I've probably a lot of questions for him. And Nelson Mandela, because what he was able to do after being in prison for 27 years to come out and do truth and reconciliation in South Africa rather than just go immediately to punishing his oppressors was something that I would love to hear from him, what his thinking was, what was it like when he was in prison, how did he keep hope alive, all that. Nelson Mandela and Bob Marley. I would love to have my ancestor I talked to you about, who was my great grandfather, who was like the village, mediator. Mm-hmm. I would love to hear from him and hear what his thinking is. The last person, John Coltrane, I would say, what makes you feel alive in your community?
The other reason that this is a really hard question is now I get to turn that back to you.
Stories, hearing people's stories, humor. I love humor and places where people feel like they can embrace humor, where people don't take themselves too seriously, but yet serious enough in certain things. And, I think one thing that we don't talk about a lot, especially in education, is love. And love, to me, when you ask the question, how do we know RJ is effective? The answer is, for me, is there love in the space? Is there love in the building, right? In the school? And you can't really prove that, which is why people don't talk about it so much, because we're so into proving things in our culture by numbers, typically, how many, how many this, how many that. But to me, nothing's more important than creating a space where love exists and where people feel like they can give and receive love. And to me, if you're doing an RJ implementation in a school, that's how you would determine if it's effective, if people are able to give and receive love in that space. And so that's what makes me feel alive. If I feel love present. And I don't think bringing love into an institution doesn't necessarily mean that you make yourself completely vulnerable to attack or whatever,
Sure.
Like it doesn't necessarily mean that. You have to know when to put your guard up, when to protect yourself, how to do that. That exists as well, because you can be harmed, but there are spaces where you can express love and you can provide a space where love can be present. And it's my job to do that.
Finally, where can people support you and your work in the ways that you want to be supported?
Oh, interesting. I mean, one way is, we do have resources that we put on our website, and I would love feedback on them. Like I said, we just released this elementary RJ toolkit, and anybody can access it. And I would love if people were teachers specifically were able to use it and then get back to me and let me know, like, hey, this could be changed. This is amazing. This worked. This didn't. That could be helpful. I mean, obviously, if people have like hundreds of thousands of dollars that they want to give us, we'll take that as well. Money's always
us too.
Yeah, you too. Yeah. We'll split that bag.
Absolutely. But we can direct people to the OUSD, like Restorative Justice website. That'll be in the show notes. David, thank you so much.
Thank you.
It has been a really fun conversation. We'll be back next week with somebody living this restorative justice life. Until then, take care.
Thank you, David and David. This is a very fun episode to listen to, and I really appreciated the conversation about restorative justice and jazz, or as I like to say, restorative justice. But I thought it was really interesting how they talked about circle processes. One thing in jazz is we often talk about the circle of fifths, which kind of is the way that we delineate different key centers and chordal relationships. And I think that that's very similar to how we see circle. We see circle as a way to kind of center ourselves and also form those relationships with seemingly unrelated things. I also think that restorative justice and jazz are intertwined because of the idea of improvisation, which is what David Yusem brought up. What does it mean to improvise? What does it mean to be in a space where you feel like you are able to improvise and not be judged for it? And I think that's another aspect of circle that's so important. In addition to the discussion about jazz, they also talked about having love in the classroom and bringing that into all of your settings. And I think that is a really beautiful way to end off this episode, and also my time here as a podcast producer of Amplify RJ. As I start back into my studies, we're going to be expanding a bit on the podcast, and so I will no longer be producing these episodes, but it has been such a pleasure, and I can't wait to see what Amplify RJ does in the future. Thanks so much for listening.
Like what you heard? Please subscribe, rate, review, and share this podcast on whatever platform you're using right now. Or if you're old school, tell a friend. It really helps us further amplify this work. You can also support us by following us on our social platforms, signing up for our email list, signing up for a community gathering, workshop, or course. So many options. Links to everything in the show notes, or on our website, amplifyrj.com. Thanks so much for listening. We'll talk to you next week.